So, as I mentioned, this was aired in 2019, so last year. This miniseries, 5 parts, each one about an hour. And it's a story, a dramatized story of the events around the nuclear disaster in April 1986. Now, the release of this show led to widespread discussion about the show itself, but also about the events. And so we really want to use this initiation here to continue this discussion. The show was created by Craig Mazin, directed by John Lang, and the main characters here are listed. I purposely kind of put on the way the actors look on their website, as well as the way they appear in the show, to really show the difference, how the transformation happens between the actor and who they portray. This show had 19 Emmy nominations and 1 Outstanding Directing, Outstanding Writing, and 4 Golden Globe nominations, Best Miniseries Made for Television, as well as Jared Harris wins Best Support Performance in the Series, 2004. Based on this show, we put together a panel with 5 panelists. First, we have Mark Sandberg from the Film Department, Jason Harris from Purdue University, a health physicist, Jean Nakamura from University of California, San Francisco, from the Oncology Department, Massimiliano Fratoni from the Nuclear Engineering Department, and Alexei Yurchak from Anthropology. Now, I would like to ask every one of the panelists to come up here, introduce themselves in more detail, and the subject matter expertise and what they thought of this show. So first, we start with Mark.
Okay, so I'm coming from the Film and Media Department, and I've been working on a project on period serial television, and when Peter talked to me about this idea, I thought it would be interesting to have somebody contextualize this series as a series and come at it from that angle. So I'll just launch right in. I have a text so that I can keep to time here. At the opening of the series Chernobyl, we hear this in voiceover. What is the cost of lies? In the mind of the series creator, Craig Mazin, that line is synonymous with another line, what is the danger of narrative? Because in interviews, he is quick to cast suspicion on his own artistic medium, noting that dramatic storytelling is essentially a form of lying that potentially carries great political danger. He understands that his position of using narrative to tell an anti-narrative story, as he puts it, is paradoxical. And that, he says, is the reason that he chose to accompany his miniseries with a podcast for each episode. Together, the show and the podcast create a front and back pair, with the show performing the magic trick and the podcast explaining how the trick was done. In this way, Mazin hoped to counteract some of the potentially deceptive effects of narrative, most fundamentally, that one must continually choose one form of depiction over another. The Chernobyl podcast was intended as a space where Mazin could come clean about his choices in the name of transparency. Mazin thinks that narrativization is unavoidable because that's how we are all wired. If he wants to reach an audience with his anti-narrative warnings, that is, he first needs to grab that audience by transforming facts into a story. But since he feels badly about this other form of lying, he feels the need to confess. He says, quote, "This is why I created a companion podcast for the show. If I cannot escape the need to tell a story, at least I can tell another story about how I made changes to tell a story. I can hold myself accountable," end quote. With the elevation of the podcast as the implicit home for truth-telling, the front has now become the back, and the back the front. By unveiling the deceptions of the show, the podcast surreptitiously slides into the position of the authoritative source. Mason even says in another interview that the podcast allows him to present material that did not conform to the conventions of screenwriting, saying, but it's important then for me to go on the podcast and say, okay, but in reality, here's the real truth, which is not narratively interesting. The question, what is the danger of narrative, has other words, for me, thus further turned into what is the danger of podcasts, because it strikes me as considerably more problematic to set up listeners to drop their guard while listening by telling them to be on their guard while watching. Here are some quick examples. In the podcast, the host interviewer Peter Sagal is quite taken by the idea of radiation contagion. He says, one of the bizarre, it seems almost unbelievable natures of radioactivity is if you become you're radiated by being exposed to something like Chernobyl, then you are just as dangerous, or at least dangerous in exactly the same way as whatever you were exposed to. Although this claim should in fact literally be an unbelievable nature of radioactivity, if we turn to our nuclear expert on the podcast, oh wait, that's Craig Mason, because there is nobody else to represent that view in this format. The reply is, quote, yes, if I breathe these things in from smoke, they are in my body, they are now radiating inside of me outwards, end quote. We see this notion played out in what the writer Mason calls the love story of the firefighter's pregnant wife, Ludmilla, who throws caution to the wind and disobeys the instructions about not touching her radiated, but probably not actually radiating husband. The podcast discussion repeats the erroneous ideas that, quote, these guys were all radioactive, end quote, as they were being treated in the hospital, while also noting condescendingly about the doctors that, quote, there wasn't a lot of awareness about radiation and how it could harm you, end quote. We might well extend that to the podcast itself if our guard had not been let down by the aura of the format. Any narrative demands choices, and some of them might be labeled inaccurate, but they could also be understood as metaphoric accommodations to the intended audience. In a sense, allowing the creators to tell a double story. This seems the best explanation for why Chernobyl borrows imagery from that other disaster, the American one on 9/11. In the scene where the firemen approach the burning reactor site in episode 1, the visual iconography resonates strongly with the scenes from Lower Manhattan immediately after the attacks. And my thanks go to my friend Amy Tick of the Albany Serial Studies Group for that insight. It might also explain why the makers of the miniseries chose to depict the views of the explosion seen from Pripyat as a tall upward beam of blue light. Even though any lighting effects following an explosion would probably not take this form. We are shown this image several times, and I'm not the only one to link this narrative choice with the annual tribute in light in New York City on the anniversaries of 9/11. The point is this: the makers of the series had to choose to depict it somehow, and they reached for an image that resonates in various ways with the series audience, either intentionally or subliminally, making the Chernobyl accident into a metaphor of 9/11. Mason is moreover about telling another double story, the one about the power of lies in our own day and time, when, as he puts it, quote, our entire planet is engaged in a war on truth, end quote. His writing of the series was interrupted by the 2016 election and its celebration of alternative facts, developments that actually led Mason to do some reshaping of the early episodes of the series. There are also climate change metaphors to be read in the twin structure of aftermath and obliviousness that can be seen in the spectators on the bridge and the children playing in the ash. Do these figures represent us equally oblivious of coming catastrophe, or worse, pitifully unaware that it is already too late? Perhaps we too are dead men walking, as Mason and Sagal are fond of saying on the podcast. The sinking worry is that, like the citizens of Pripyat watching the nuclear light show on the bridge, we too have ignored facts that will eventually force themselves on us inexorably, like nuclear waste registry on a dosimeter. Mason says in the podcast, but the truth doesn't care and it will get you in the end. He makes that sound like a bad thing, but isn't that also our most fervent fantasy in what otherwise looks like a post-factual world of pure power politics? Thanks.
Our next subject area expert is Jason Harris from Purdue University. He's on the panel because he's a health physicist and can speak to the health effects of radiation to human bodies and what may have taken place at the time.
Okay, good afternoon. First of all, let me say thank you to Peter for the invitation coming across the country. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. As Peter mentioned, I'm a health physicist, and for those that aren't familiar with what a health physicist is, essentially we're individuals that are responsible for protecting people in the environment from the harmful effects of radiation while using the benefits that we get from the different technologies that generate this radiation. My interest in the series really came about because for the last 25 years or so, I studied the effects of radiation, especially from releases from nuclear facilities, specifically nuclear power plants. So I did work not as much related to Chernobyl, but looking at the effects on our own releases from the power plants within the US, but then also looking at effects from various accidents, most frequently with the Fukushima accident that occurred in 2011 from Japan. I helped the US industry evaluate the releases that we saw from Fukushima. For example, the first nuclear power plant in the US to see the effects from Fukushima was the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, which is located here in California. So we did comparisons of what the releases were, the type of radionuclides that we were seeing, what the impact was here in the US, and then also compared those releases to what we saw in Chernobyl. So I've had a real, desire to learn about these releases, and was especially excited to hear about Chernobyl when it was developed, the series at least, and really try to take an in-depth look as to what the accuracies but also the fallacies were when it came to the numbers related to radiation, the health effects that were given in the series, and I won't say too much about that because our next speaker, Gene, will cover that, but then also to evaluate what was given in terms of the contamination and the environmental effects that were portrayed within the series. So I have a few slides. I won't. I'm obviously not going to be as eloquent as our former speaker, but I do want to talk about some of the effects and some of the numbers that were given, and kind of put into perspective what was truth and what was or I guess what was fact and what was fiction. First of all, a lot of this is getting based not only on my own research, but also on the probably hundreds of papers I've read related to the environmental as well as the health effects from Chernobyl. To give you a perspective, first of all, the amount of radiation or radioactivity that was released into Chernobyl was quite substantial. I mentioned the previous or most recent accident of Fukushima. Chernobyl was a whole order of magnitude, right? So 10 times larger in terms of the release of radioactivity into the environment. Most of this was in the form of noble gases. Noble gases, which are inert and don't react. Whenever you have a reactor accident, most of those gases are released almost immediately. There's really nothing stopping them. So noble gases such as xenon and krypton were released into the environment. And then you have a number of other radionuclides that cause various issues, both from an environmental and health perspective. So for instance, iodine-131, which is of significance because of its uptake to the thyroid. There was a significant fraction of the total inventory of iodine that was released from the accident. Cesium-137, which is significant because of the environmental contamination. There was also, again, a significant fraction of that released from the accident. And then some other radionuclides as well, including plutonium-239. One thing that the series tends to portray is the hundreds or if not thousands of individuals that were hospitalized. In reality, there were only about 200 people that were hospitalized from what we call acute radiation sickness. So this is from radiation doses that were high enough to cause relatively immediate effects. Again, about 200 such individuals were hospitalized. Most of these were the workers that you saw, either the firefighters or liquidators that really did provide heroic effort in trying to put out the fire. Also, some of the individuals that helped with trying to remove the graphite as part of the cleanup process. There were those individuals too that received acute effects as well. But one thing that's important to portray is that no one from the general public, none of the individuals, the residents of Pripyat and any of the surrounding areas were actually hospitalized for these high radiation doses. The series also talks about the number of individuals that died and makes reference many times to tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of dying, whether it be from immediate effects or long-term effects such as cancer. The fact there, though, is that to this day, we can only attribute about 32 individuals actually dying from radiation-induced effects from the accident. These were 32 workers that died from this acute radiation sickness, about 29 within the first couple months of the accident and a few more later. One thing that we mentioned in our discussion previous to this panel was that the film or the series does acknowledge or says that the Soviet Union acknowledges just 31 individuals. Here I use 32, and the reason for that is, if you remember from the series, the main scientist, Lagasa, he ended up committing suicide, and so that individual makes up the 32nd individual, if you will. The Soviet Union does not, or did not acknowledge him as a victim of this accident. Another thing, again, not to get caught up, because I know not everyone understands the difference between the doses, but overall, the average dose of individuals, especially within about 30 kilometers of Chernobyl, was quite low, in the order of roughly 0.1 gray or in the order of tens of rads. So this would not be enough to cause acute radiation syndrome or any immediate effects from radiation. And again, that wasn't necessarily portrayed within the series. And then outside that zone, of course, the radiation doses were much lower. One thing, though, which makes it maybe a little bit difficult to understand within the series is they use different types of units. They constantly use the Rankine, which is a unit of exposure, which does not translate easily to what the dose and the effect is on a human being. So there's some confusion with that that we can talk about later if you have questions about it. Now, not to say that there weren't other effects that we saw from the accident. Besides those that were killed from the effects of acute radiation syndrome, the other major effects that we do see were in the thyroid doses, mainly from, again, that uptake of the iodine-131, both within the 30-kilometer area and then also in hotspots around Chernobyl, specifically in the global region of Belarus. We did see elevated doses thyroid doses that did lead to thyroid cancers, and in many cases, there needed to be surgeries or ablations because of that. So this was really seen as the main radiation effect to the region, was these elevated thyroid doses that resulted in pretty high doses, especially to children. And children are more susceptible because of their being just more sensitive to radiation. Again, we can talk about that later if you like. Now, there were, of course, significant contamination events and effects that were portrayed, I would say, accurately within Chernobyl. There is evidence that thousands of acres of coniferous forest surrounding the area were indeed impacted. There was significant hotspots that did lead to loss or lack of biodiversity in areas. And there continues to be studies today to show how the radiation has affected the biodiversity and in many ways has been lethal or at least deleterious in this way. But at the same time, there have been what we call cold spots. So there are these pockets of areas surrounding these high radiation areas that were not affected and have actually seen the opposite effect. They've seen growth in biodiversity, they've seen flourishing of many different species, essentially because these areas are really untouched by human activities, and again have shown really not only resilience but growth in many different species. But again, significant contamination occurred. There was a massive effort to try to remove topsoil from some of this contamination, mainly from the cesium-137. And I think the final couple things to say is that over the years there have been significant studies that have been done by the international community. Two most notable ones are called the International Chernobyl Project and the Chernobyl Forum, and again, continue studies today. But if you look at all of the papers that have come out, thousands of papers now from these different studies, what you tend to see is that there are really, besides the thyroid cancers and the acute radiation sickness, there really were no significant non-radiation or radiation health disorders. But maybe what is more important and wasn't covered, I would say, enough in the series is that there were significant non-radiation related health effects, right? Stress, anxiety, nervousness, what we call psychosomatic effects that we know does manifest itself in real, detrimental health outcomes. So spontaneous abortions, suicides, a lot of this did occur because of people's feelings about their exposure, whether it was real or perceived. And then even with again, I guess to wrap up, with the number of cancer incidents that were proclaimed in the series, overall, if you look at the data and the studies that are published, there really has not been statistically significant increases in cancer besides the thyroid cancers that have been seen. So even for cleanup workers, where there are hundreds of thousands of them, if you look at those surveyed, there's only been about a 0.1% increase in cancers, and this has not been statistically significant. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over, and Gene will talk more about it.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jane Nakamura, and I'm a faculty physician at UCSF. And so I wanted to thank you here for organizing this, because it's been a really interesting experience to certainly hear other people's perspectives on this show and event. So my background is I am a radiation oncologist. I practice at UCSF, and my clinical expertise is in brain tumors and neuro-oncology in general. My clinical practice involves delivering therapeutic radiation, typically utilizing radiosurgery techniques. I also have a very large research interest in radiation-induced tumorigenesis. And so I have a laboratory at UCSF Mission Bay, where my laboratory has been studying mechanisms of radiation-induced tumorigenesis, and we utilize mouse models that are genetically engineered to harbor certain genetic susceptibilities. And so we utilize models to try to investigate how radiation exposure, ionizing radiation, leads to genetic alterations that can then manifest as cancer. We also study radiation-induced malignancies in people, in patients. And in our comparative studies between humans and patients, we identified genetic motifs, mutational motifs that are conserved between species. And so this is an area of study and emphasis for us. So talking about the health consequences of radiation exposure. So this is a topic that I discuss routinely in my clinical practice, but obviously Chernobyl, it was a very special type of event. So first off, I think it's important to be aware, as informed citizens, all organs are susceptible to radiation injury. So there is no organ that can be considered immune from or inherently innately protected from radiation injury. But some of the challenges medically are that organs have differing sensitivities, and they also differ in their physiologic response rates. And so as a medical professional, when we talk about or when we see patients, individuals who are reported to have experienced total body radiation exposure or even focal exposure, we are very concerned about obtaining a history and importantly details concerning the exposure itself. And types of exposure, types of, for example, isotopes that are involved, areas, anatomic areas that have been exposed, the timing, and so there are a number of variables that influence how what kinds of toxicities we are concerned about, and certainly how we need to care for such individuals. Now, this here is a sort of a gross timeline that is very incomplete, but what I wanted to illustrate or at least list were the major symptoms that are depicted actually in the Chernobyl show, but that are in fact reflective and accurate in terms of radiation, acute radiation sickness and radiation toxicities in people. And so as I mentioned, the timeline for radiation toxicity varies per organ. And so, and because I talk to patients and I see some of the popular conceptions, I guess the misconceptions about how radiation is perceived, there are many ideas about how radiation functions and certainly what to expect. But importantly, radiation exposure influences each organ in a very cell-specific manner. And so this is actually very well reflected in the timing and the types of toxicities that individuals, particularly the individuals who were exposed in the immediate moments after the Chernobyl accident. Those toxicities are shown here and were depicted. And I think the series does a reasonable job at illustrating the major toxicities that initial workers, individuals present would have suffered from. So namely, radiation toxicity can begin very acutely, within minutes of exposure. And from there on, the consequences of radiation can unfold truly over months and even years. And so initially, the immediate toxicities that you see in the first episode, where the initial leakage is detected, you see engineers and plant staff developing nausea and vomiting. That is accurate. And in fact, from our clinical experience, we know that nausea and vomiting can develop at very low doses doses that would otherwise be non-injurious to any other organ. And furthermore, nausea and vomiting can develop within, even in my experience, minutes after radiation exposure to the gastrointestinal tract. So I thought that was actually very accurate. Now you also see they depict reddening of the skin, so cutaneous toxicity. And that also is accurate. Skin toxicity is an organ that responds acutely to radiation exposure and can become visibly red and eventually later on can break down. But this initial cutaneous reaction is accurate. And so that certainly it's depicted there. Now, later, so meaning days to weeks, what's depicted in the Chernobyl miniseries is there's deeper, more severe organ injury, and that's more apparent when you see the characters who are hospitalized. And so very notably depicted are the very deep soft tissue injuries, so the ulcerations that, namely the firefighters, ulcerations. These are injuries of the skin that can then break down to deeper layers of tissue. And I thought that was also accurate and something, it's an injury that we can even see today in modern times. Bone marrow failure. So bone marrow failure is also a known, well-recognized complication after total body exposure. And this reflects the fact that the bone marrow, the cellular components of bone marrow, so the bone marrow stem cells, are highly radiosensitive, remarkably radiosensitive. And so this means that even at relatively low exposures, bone marrow failure can manifest. And what this ultimately means is that the loss of the stem cells leads to loss of the cellular blood components. And there are several, but namely red blood cells. So loss of red blood cells will lead to anemia, loss of white blood cells, which will compromise immune function, and then loss of megakaryocytes, and these are cells that actually produce platelets. Platelets are required for coagulation, for clotting. And so this global loss of stem cell populations in the bone marrow have very severe consequences, and these take time to manifest because the half-lives, the lifespans of each of these cell components are different. And so that's why bone marrow toxicities don't become evident until days and even weeks as these firefighters are recuperating, we think, in the hospital. In fact, they're only facing actually more grave injury. So that's one element that is very accurate. Now, given the design of the show, clearly they're focusing on the initial events, days to weeks after the accident. But I want to just inform people that there are actually many radiation toxicities that can develop over years that weren't touched upon in the show, but are certainly of concern for healthcare professionals who would be caring for such a population. Cancer is a late toxicity that was mentioned multiple times in the show. It's an active concern for the individuals who are participating in the management of Chernobyl. And this is a real concern. Now, cancer formation, how does this differ from the acute toxicities that I just described? Cancer formation in the context of ionizing radiation is a development that relates to chemical effects, changes on the genome that are mediated by ionizing radiation. And in this context, you have tissues that have been mutagenized, but have not been injured sufficiently to lead to death. And so what this practically means for people is that one can have a mutagenized cell type, in fact, many mutagenized cells, that over time can then be primed for cancer formation, and typically over the course of years. And so this is a real concern, and one that we actually are very sensitive to, given the severity, the gravity of having a cancer diagnosis. Now, actually, as Jason, I want to just agree with Jason that the actual cancer burden resulting directly attributable to Chernobyl has been very low. It's not very notable, even though it's obviously a concern. Thyroid cancer detection that I would also add is correct. I just want to add one detail, which is that the spike in thyroid cancers was noted in children. It was noted in children less than 5 years of age. So obviously none of the workers, right? None of the adults. And so that's a point that I just wanted to raise as an additional piece of information. We know from a general carcinogenesis standpoint, mutagenization of younger tissues, so namely children, developing tissues, harbors more risk for cancer formation. And so I think, so this is not obviously relevant because children were involved in Chernobyl per se, but from an overall public health standpoint and in terms of our understanding or prioritization of how do we manage a population who may be at risk, I just point out, and this is actually an area for my research, that children who are, exposures to children in particular raise a real concern. And in fact, the Chernobyl experience actually bears that out. So now in terms of some of the inaccuracies, I would say that the Chernobyl miniseries does promote some ideas that frankly don't make sense. So this idea that being irradiated renders one then radioactive obviously doesn't make sense. And so seeing that, I just thought it was strange. I think that the overall, given what they were trying to accomplish, I think at least the acute toxicities were reasonably portrayed, and otherwise, this is a radiation toxicity is one that we don't really think about very often, and yet radiation triggers so much fear in people. So I thought, from my standpoint, I thought the Chernobyl miniseries was interesting, and it had some facts pretty well depicted and others that were not so well depicted. But happy to take questions.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Alexei Yurchak. I'm professor of anthropology here in Berkeley. And I work on the late Soviet and post-Soviet history in Russia mostly, also to some extent in Europe, Ukraine. Also work on science studies. I have a book called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, which is about the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the period just before. In fact, the period of the historical when Chernobyl happened is also covered there. And I have a new project about Lenin's body, the laboratory, which has been preserving and maintaining it, and doing a lot of very interesting, sometimes very wacky kind of science on the side. So I will first talk about the show from the point of view sort of media anthropology of media, which is connected to what we talked about in the first presentation. The show was very quickly translated into Russian, Ukrainian, and other languages. It was shown in Russia, so I'm interested here to talk to you about the way it has been received from that perspective. It was, first of all, it aired, and it can still be watched on TNT channel, which is very similar to the format of iTunes here, where you pay per episode, or you buy the whole season. So it's kind of pay-per-view channel. They have a regular broadcast, and they have also online service, which is where most people watch the rest of others as well. There was an overwhelmingly positive response, although barriers, which I will discuss. One of the first things people discuss, and you see this in the online discussions and blogs, Facebooks, and everywhere of that kind of internet discussions, how incredibly true and authentic to the materiality of life during that period the show is. In fact, so authentic that it's unprecedented. It's almost difficult to compare with anything, including Russian or Soviet films about that period. And I know from the podcast as well that the creator, Craig Mazin, he spoke to a lot of people about that period, but they filmed in Lithuania, which is very close to Ukraine and Belarus, in fact, borders on Belarus. And they used a lot of the materiality, clothes, everyday objects, paraphernalia of the everyday, and also cars and all sorts of different landscape elements, which were taken from Belarus. And Belarus Film, which is a big film studio in Minsk, helped them immensely with that, even though the filming was based mostly in Lithuania, which is now part of the EU, and it had some legal reasons for being filmed there. It is true that most people in these discussions, they sometimes start the discussions by saying, oh my God, I saw this, I had this tablecloth in my house, or we had exactly the same clock on our table, and so forth. And how could they, this British-American team, recreate that? But then, very quickly, there is a kind of other tone in the discussions which emerges, and that is a very blatant misrepresentations, and those have a certain kind of ideological undertones to them. Well, first of all, the most trivial ones, the academician Negasov is shown to be living in this small dilapidated apartment. In fact, he was an academician, head of the apartment. He lived there with his wife and 2 kids, not just with a cat, as he is portrayed. But that's maybe not so important, right? He is portrayed as a much more pedestrian kind of guy. But then the general set of relations between the state and the common people is created in a way which doesn't ring true at all, and often rings the bell of this kind of a Cold War assumptions and familiar misrepresentations and stereotypes which we know from so many other films. For example, when Negasov and this member of the Politburo fly to Pripyat from Moscow after the disaster happens. First of all, they fly in a helicopter, and that didn't happen because it's like flying to Vancouver in a helicopter from here. So they flew in an airplane to Kiev, and then they drove. But nevertheless, this Politburo member says, if you don't explain to me how the reactor works, I'll have this soldier throw you out of the helicopter. It's just unimaginable that this kind of conversation would happen between the Politburo member and the academician. Of course, they had a very amicable discussion about the nuclear reactor, and Negasov actually writes about this. Then you see a lot of the episodes where in the station itself there are these soldiers everywhere with machine guns, often at the ready. You probably remember very well the episode of the miners, the poor miners who are asked from the Russian part to come to Chernobyl. By the way, the miners, most of them came from Tula, from Russia, as opposed to Donbass in Ukraine, and which was close. And the reason for that is that the soil in Tula, which is sandy soil, is very similar to Pripyat. And so the kind of tunnel they had to dig in this area of Pripyat was something they would be familiar with. They had the technology, they had the know-how. In Donbass, it's much deeper mines, and it's a different kind of very hard soil and stones. Even though Donbass mines were there as well, these so these mines have been visited by the Minister of Mining, Mikhail Sharav. Okay. This one here. And you remember, if you saw the show, he is portrayed as this very kind of, as a real bureaucratic rat, kind of pen pusher, who is not confident of himself. And he is accompanied actually by 2 soldiers who instantly take off their machine guns and stand like this in front of the miners. And then the foreman says, okay, you can shoot us, but you will not turn up bullets for all of us, and then we'll kill you. This is the foreman today, and he was, I mean, the Russian had a lot of this fun discussing the show with the actual people who are being portrayed. And he said, this couldn't happen. First of all, this minister was one of us. He worked in this Tula mines. He happened to be from Tula as well. And he started there at age 15, we all knew him, we respected him. He came, he sat with us in the mine, he explained what happened, and he said, we really need your help. You will be paid, he also said 5 times your salary, but I only volunteers. Almost everyone volunteered, but not everyone. But the idea that there would be the soldiers, and somehow they would be, first of all, protecting the machine guns, the minister, and second of all, kind of threatening people to participate, because otherwise there will be an idea they can be shot, it's completely unthinkable. And I think it goes back to a certain kind of assumptions about how the Soviet Union worked, right? This system of completely corrupt bureaucracy and people who are being oppressed and are always ready to revolt against that bureaucracy. I mean, it was a very authoritarian state. It was a state which controlled its information. It was a very secretive state, but it didn't work that way. It works in a much more complex way, and this is a very big shame. Which is unfortunate, because as I said, the materiality of the show is incredible. And then they walked past that minister, and they basically rubbed their dirty hands off his clothes, and again, this comment happened. And these are some of the miners today. They watched the show with the correspondent and provided a lot of commentary. All of this is available if you're interested. Another interesting episode with the miners is when they work naked. And this guy said, why would we work naked? What's the reason? It was hot, but not that hot. It's always hot in mines, and this wasn't a nudist beach. So they were really flabbergasted, actually, in that explanation. Apparently, in the old days in the mines in Donbass, which are much deeper and much hotter as a result, people worked in their underwear. But it's completely unthinkable in modern times because it's also very dangerous. There's so much equipment there. Anyway, I think this is also interesting because one of the messages of Martin, and it's a correct message, was that we are showing the way lies work, right? One of the messages that there's always a cost of lies. And the second message is we are showing the sacrifice and heroism of normal people, of regular people. And it's also true. But somehow it's undermined by the message that this heroism and sacrifice are often done with the gunpoint, which is, I found surprising. And this is another example of the same. And then this, in the first episode, this old man talking in the party meetings, at the local council meeting, when they're trying to decide what to do about the information about the disaster, and he gives them this talk about Lenin and how he would be proud. It also sounds very untrue. In the 1980s, these kind of scenes, I would understand that they depicted 1930s, but not 1980s. So it's interesting, there is this mismatched representation about materiality and about the actual kind of underlying ideology of life. There's a clear misunderstanding of how it works. Water absolutely everywhere. It's in big amounts. People drink. Look, they drink huge glasses. Look at this amount of water. I mean, people, of course, drink vodka in Russia, and they drink a lot of vodka, but not in this kind of context. These two scientists talk to each other and they drink vodka. It reminded me a little bit of the madman, when they constantly drink scotch and somehow nothing happens to them, and they're always sober. It's the same here. Well, and then these divers, by the way, all three of them are alive, and they also commented on this scene. They're coming out, they're met by soldiers, for some reason with rifles, and then each is given a bottle of vodka as a reward. Which is, again, I mean, it's such an unfortunate undermining of this very profound message by putting in this really simplistic stereotypes. And the guy who is the party secretary who talks to Uliana, what's her name, she's a made-up character, a scientist. He talks to her and says, I don't care, we will not going to inform anyone, and then pours himself in his office in front of the vodka and says, to the workers of the world, and drink like total cynicism. So, again, this just wouldn't happen. I mean, they were all cynical, but not in that way. The use of language, I was asked to talk about the use of language, and well, I already mentioned this. Shoot us, you won't have enough bullets. But the word comrade. This is interesting because Martin in the podcast explained that everyone addresses each other comrade all the time. In official context, in unofficial context, in the hospital, comrade, without last name. But then this is also a strange misrepresentation, which to me, again, suggests a particular kind of political understanding of that reality. Because comrade is not just sir, it's a very politically charged term, right? Comrade is exotic and it's also ideologized. And I think, and it's not, of course, used in this way at all. It's very rarely used. It's used with the last name or name and patronymic and only in official, it's very, in official contexts, in meetings. It's a very distancing kind of term. So most of the people address each other by names and names and patronymic. So to the Russian audience, this sounds strange. Or to the, I shouldn't say Russian, to the former Soviet audience. And this is an interesting thing which again, to me, suggests a very legal understanding of what this show is by those who make it. This is Lyudmila Ignatyenko, who is the widow of Vasily, and their story, as we've already heard, the story of Lyudmila and Vasily is one of the main stories. There are several stories in this series. And Vasily dies, of course, he's one of the first respondents, the firefighter. And she loses a baby after that, remember? She now lives in Kiev, this is her now, and BBC found her. Turns out she didn't know about the film being made, the real name is used, and she's reading bitter, and I wanted to read it, because some of you are from journalism, I wanted to read this quote. When I found out there would be a film about me, I felt hurt and uneasy. Why didn't they ask me, or come and talk to me, prepare me for it in a human way? That we're making the film about you and your husband. She was interviewed, she speaks Ukrainian in the interview, she's from that part of Ukraine. There were people hounding at me in my apartment. I got to the point when journalists would jam the door open with their foot and try to record interviews with me. What could I tell them if I knew nothing about the film? Literally nothing. I found out from the advertisements that there was a film about me. I was so exhausted, so broken, the calls kept coming, one after the other. I had to move out of my apartment in Kiev because they robbed me to peace. So it's an interesting thing that, to some extent, there is this claim of authenticity, and to a very large extent, it's met. I think it is really quite remarkable how authentic the timeline and a lot of the elements of the story are. And at the same time, there's this constant, profound undermining of this authenticity, some of it ideological and some of it of that sort. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Massimiliano Fratoni. I'm an associate professor here at UC Berkeley in the nuclear engineering department. My research is mostly in the design of advanced reactor design and advanced fuel cycle for the sustainable nuclear energy. So what I do every day is to think about reactors, to teach about reactors. So it shouldn't come to a surprise to you if I have a positive bias towards this series. And this is very simple. If I think about these two characters over here, Valery Legasov, this is a real character, and Lana Komyuk, this is only a character, it's made up. It's meant to represent the group of other scientists and engineers that were working with Legasov. Well, these are the reactor physicists, and the reactor physicists are the truth seeker, are those that know what is happening, those that can understand events, predict events, and save lives. So as a reactor physicist, I can only appreciate that. Now, this is probably a stretch. I don't believe reality things were so straight. Probably fiction had a big role in this. In addition to this, as a reactor physicist, I really appreciate the level of details, technical details that we see from the series. Again, as a reactor physicist, I talked about reactivity coefficient, control rules, reactivity balance every day. This is my everyday jargon. But I will never expect to see this on TV. Never to see this on a TV series, or at least the Bobina series, no one would watch it. It was interesting in activity coefficients. Okay, so seeing these topics to be covered on a TV series with worldwide success was very interesting. And to me, this scene over here is really a key scene. This is episode 5 during the trial. On Legasov explained how the reactor works. I explained this beautiful dance between the different reactivity effects in the reactor, and then reconstruct the event. I think this scene was created with very, very high accuracy. I think the event is described very well. I think really the authors went into the details. They were able to sort of digest what happened and then reconstruct it in a way that was accessible. Not to everybody, at least to most people that were watching the show. So it was really a good balance between excess of details and oversimplification. That said, my main concern with the show is definitely the narrative about explosion. This is one of the stories within the story that goes through every episode. It starts with the explosion that nobody can explain, and the two physicists, Legasov and Komyuk, through the 5 episodes, try to explain why did the reactor explode. And underneath it is really, why did the reactor explode like a nuclear bomb? From episode 1, we learned that it's impossible the reactor explodes like a nuclear bomb. At least that's what everyone believes. And that's a question that reactor physicists and nuclear engineers get all the time. What if the reactor explodes like a bomb? And you're always going to get the same answer. The reactor cannot explode like a bomb. So on one side, the story embraces narrative, the narrative of the nuclear engineer. But on the other side, embrace this collective imaginary that the reactor will explode like a bomb. So if you Google Chernobyl explosion, you get a fake image like this one with a passion cloud that is clearly a fake image. So through the 5 episodes, this narrative develops, and there is never talking about bomb, there's always talking about explosion, until episode 5, and at the end of that scene, very well done scene where Legasov described the sequence of events. He concludes that Chernobyl reactor 4 is now a nuclear bomb. That's where the narrative finally develops into the parallel between a nuclear bomb and a reactor. Well, this is not really the case. The explosion of the reactor was not the explosion of a bomb. It was more a chemical explosion, a steam explosion. Without wanting to bore you with the details, this is like a little explanation of how the reactor will look like. This reactor is a RBMK reactor out there within the Russian. But this reactor, so you only find these reactors in the former Soviet Union. It's a reactor basically made of a block of graphites, piled up with a hole in the middle. If you really would like to, you could buy one on eBay. I don't know how much money is going to go. I'm sure after the series the price has skyrocketed. This is the same graphite that you've seen in episode 1. It is the end of the firefighter collecting that piece of graphite from the floor and asking, what is this? Okay. So inside its holes, we have the reactor fuel. The reactor fuel is nothing else that is this pipe over here. These are the fuel rods. This is a pipe, and inside the pipe is water. And the water is the function to cool the fuel, make steam, and then produce electricity. Well, this is the picture of the representation of the reactor core. Okay, so we'll have the fuel down here, and then we'll have this we call this lead up here, these 1,000 tons of cement and metallic structure on top of the reactor core. And this will be the top of the reactor core. This is actually an actual picture of the reactor core. Well, what happened is the accident evolves. we have a rapid generation of power, so a lot of heat produced very quickly. And as the heat gets produced very quickly, the water becomes steam. And you can imagine this is sort of a pressure cooker, or way too much steam inside, or the lid is going to blow up. And that's that blowing up is depicted in the movie with these elements moving up and down and eventually explode. Now you may think, well, what does it make a difference if it's a nuclear explosion or a steam explosion? Actually, there were more explosions. Supposedly, there was also an hydrogen explosion. So, not a single explosion from steam. But it makes a difference because we do expect this kind of accident when we design reactors. And indeed, what we do in Western reactors, we have a big, thick, strong containment building reactors that are exactly made to be able to contain that energy release and to contain that radioactivity release from a potential accident. In this case, in these RBK reactors, and as of also says at the end of this discussion, there is no containment building. So once the reactor goes up, there is no way to contain the radioactivity that's been released. So positive and negative, but I'd like to conclude my remarks with a little thought here. I'm using help from an alumnus of our department, Darren Blumen. He wrote this script in 1997, and basically suggesting if you want to kill any conversation, just tell that you are a nuclear engineer. Well, I'm afraid that you have to update this. Probably Chernobyl has changed this. So if you say you're a nuclear engineer, you're going to have to ask you regularly to watch Chernobyl. And I think this is great. This is great for our community because it's a possibility to start a conversation, about the work that we do every day, to design reactors to avoid these accidents, to design a way to mitigate the consequences of the accidents in case there should be an accident. And also there's a great way to have general discussions about nuclear and how maybe the benefits of the technology may outweigh by far the risk associated with it. Thank you.
All right. So this concludes the remark section from our panelists. So I would like to solicit questions or comments from the audience. And until we get nobody actually submitted any online questions. We asked for link and nobody used it. So please feel free to do that. Maybe I'll start with one question quickly, so the format. And I would like to wrap around between our first speaker and our last speaker. As our first speaker mentioned, it was remarkable this column of light going up, right? And this is something triggered his interest. And I would like to ask Professor Fratoni here, is this a thing? Is this actually something that could have happened, or is this total fiction?
So I believe the blue light that we see also represents the Chernobyl effect. So I think any nuclear engineer is familiar with this effect that we mostly see in pools, reactor pools, or research reactors. This is an indirect effect of radiations, obviously because it's visible, so it's in the visible range, and it's made this typical blue light. So the same effect that we see in water is possible in air. It's just that I think this effect will look like more like a glow around the plant and not a beam that goes up high. There is no reason why radiation will go in the same direction. So I think this is something that starts from something realistic and then goes something unrealistic.
So, okay. I have a whole stack of questions here, so in case you run out. But please.
So, have you given this feedback to the producers? Have you all given this feedback to the producers of the show?
No, we have not been talking to the producers at all. Now, we did discuss, however, if this is a good, interesting discussion, we actually had several hours of discussion in my office already about it. And it turns out that there's not enough time to simply talk about everything. If this is a good momentum and we have a good discussion, maybe we want to do that going forward. But in the meantime, we have not.
So to follow up on that, about the explosion, there was enough energy to put stuff thousands of feet into the air?
Yes, there are actually multiple explosions. A first explosion that blew up the roof, and then a second explosion that blew up actually core components out to the air. And at that point, there is also support. Likely, this is not very clear, but it's also at the point high temperature steam reacting with the zero carbonic lighting that is making hydrogen. So there is also an hydrogen explosion on top of the steam explosion, like we have seen in Fukushima. So definitely that was the case.
Question here?
Yeah. So thank you. Really interesting hearing everything all at once. And it just made me think, like, from different perspectives, it seems like we learned that this show is really good at portraying certain things, especially like short-term effects, material things, right? Like the cars, the clothes. But it's kind of bad at portraying the longer-term stuff where you need to like zoom out, like the statistics about how much actual cancer there was and things like that. And I just wonder if you could kind of reflect on what this might tell us about like how science gets communicated in this particular form, right, the miniseries, and like what kind of consequences that might have thinking about how to communicate scientific truth in general, rather than like, is this true or not? Like, can TV even communicate something like that?
This is an excellent question, so who wants to take it?
Also, well,
No, go ahead. No, sorry.
I think one of the points I wanted to make in relation to this question, and I might have made that point during my presentation, is that this show, just like all narratives, I guess, to a greater or less extent, is framed within a much larger set of understandings, assumptions about history, about politics, about relations, about political systems. And it doesn't really manage to transcend those or to reflect upon those, in my opinion, in a satisfactory way, even though it claims it does. And so the kind of conversations about truth which you're asking about, including the truth about science or the truth about a particular kind of event or disaster, or a large truth about the system and the kind of tradition of secrecy which that system imposes upon those truths, is narrated through a larger frame of political assumptions. And one thing which I would like to mention here is that there's a big debate going on in this different blogs in Russia in this case. I don't know how it is in other parts of the form. So I read some discussions in Russia, and there's a big question which is being asked, and people have been debating it now for months. Would they do it? What is the politics of representing the truth according to the HBO or according to the sort of media in general in the US? Would they make a similar kind of show about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Very different, and you can also narrate the story from the point of view of the victims, the children, the people. It's a very controversial and which is not really spoken about very much in this country. It's not a big public sort of debate issue. Would they revisit that and open up that can? And there's been different discussions, and I'm very curious about this, because that, in a sense, points to the question about truths. Like, how does one communicate them? And which things are available for this kind of discussion, and which we better don't judge. Even though we claim that we are completely devoted to people truth and nothing but the truth. it seems like maybe not, maybe there's a framing going on. So, okay.
I would want to add to that it's not been that long that television shows wouldn't have something called a research department attached to them, and there's a certain form of television, especially the period serial drama, that has hired so-called research teams to create this material authenticity and to create the sense of sort of uncanny time travel and the other things that period shows do very well. So it's not by accident that Mad Men and Chernobyl are in some ways in the same kind of universe, because they are the same kind of show. And so if you take it out of the particular science context that it's talking about and look at it as a certain kind of television show, we can sort of get to this question of how good is television at performing research and communicating research, and what kind of research do they do. So, not surprisingly, the kind of research that period television dramas need is usually 5 minutes of research on the internet. People were amazed by Mad Men that they would get the weather forecast right on the day that they were depicting, and it was really raining in New York that day, et cetera, et cetera. That's a 5-minute job for an intern to go to the New York Times archive and find the forecast, and then that gets recycled into this kind of promotion by the series that it's research heavy. It's really, really, really authentic. And when you listen to the podcast and hear Craig Mazin and Peter Sagal sort of go down the rabbit hole of authenticity, you can sort of see that what they're talking about as research and what we at our one university would think of as research is a very different thing. We would evaluate sources, we would consult multiple sources, we would try to bring together evidence, we would look at what's sort of consensus and outlier opinions. And a good example is what Alexei was talking about with the comrade issue on the podcast. Craig Mazin says that he consulted somebody from Ukraine about the script, and the person said, "You need more comrades in there." And to a certain kind of research activity, consulting one person is, I'm sure that's way more than Craig Mazin did on the scripts for Hangover 2 and 3, which he also wrote, and so there, he felt like he was engaged in a really different kind of activity here, but that's not the same as communicating the kind of research that's being done at a university and putting that into this format. So there are definite production pressures about timeline and about how fast things are being produced. Obviously, this is only a miniseries, so it's not an ongoing challenge of television production where episodes are being written, just ahead of them being shot. That kind of thing obviously puts a really different pressure on the idea of authenticity in historical research. Ways of interpreting the series against the expertise that all of you could bring to it. So I really enjoyed this kind of cross-disciplinary discussion.
Thank you all for coming. I would like to also invite you that in the link which was sent out for the invite, there's a Google Doc, so we keep that open. So if anybody has any further questions or comments or suggestions to this panel, please let us know. I also would like to make a comment that none of these panels would be possible without contributions from our alumni and other folks who contribute to the department. So if you like this kind of thing, it would be nice to acknowledge them as well. And then last but not least, really thank you for coming, and thanks to the panel. This was truly exciting, and I hope we keep this discussion going.